Hazel Griffin and Glyn Dix fall in love.
Indeed, they were regarded by everyone as being the perfect couple, the lovey-dovey couple.
But what could Hazel really know about the man that she had met behind bars?
He'd stopped taking his medication and became severely mentally ill, psychotic.
Because he has no contact with reality, Glyn Dix did and always does represent a danger to anybody in contact with him.
To me, he's just a bomb waiting to go off.
Has Hazel married a man who was made for murder? Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. It was in 1997 when 47-year-old mum of six Hazel Griffin meets Glyn Dix.
She came to see him. She couldn't resist him.
He was sharing a prison cell with her son, Adam.
Adam had grown to regard Glyn as perhaps his best friend.
Adam is serving time for driving offences. Hazel visits him regularly.
He's formed a friendship with her son, Adam. He appears to her obviously an attractive man, somebody that she's interested in.
So when she starts this relationship with Dix, she's not concerned. She's not concerned about his past. They spark up a relationship.
They end up being pen pals.
Dix was 18 years into a minimum term of 20 years in prison for murder. Yet Hazel seemed to have few qualms about befriending him, given how he appeared.
The confusing thing about someone like Glyn Dix is that you wouldn't pick up in meeting him, in making his acquaintance, anything sinister, threatening, hostile, angry, anything that seemed particularly dangerous about him. And that's because he doesn't have that kind of personality. He's not driven by hatred. He's not driven by anger or really any kind of vindictive agenda or violent urges at all. That's not who Glyn Dix is.
Hazel was soon regularly visiting Dix in prison. And after a few months, she announced to everybody that she was in love and that they were going to get married.
By now, Hazel believes that she knows all that she needs to about the man she's due to marry. He has admitted that in 1980 he was convicted of shooting a young woman, Pia Overbury. But he'd not exactly told the full truth.
Dix has woven a complicated web of lies about himself. There is no mention of the fact that he's in there for life for killing a woman in the manner that he did. He's created this whole persona of himself, which is not reflected in his reality.
In fact, Glyn Dix told Hazel and her family that he had been framed for Pia's murder. It was an outlandish tale.
I think because that trust had already started and been built and, possibly Hazel was a bit vulnerable, that he got away with those stories and presented himself as somebody who was not dangerous at all.
He comes up with some strange story about being in the elite army and that he was involved in this altercation, and when he woke up he had a shotgun in his hand and a woman was dead.
The true story of 32-year-old Pia Overbury's death was much darker than Glyn would have anyone believe.
So we're in the 1970s. We are in Gloucester. Now, Glyn Dix stood out even then as a bit of a local oddity. People remembered him.
Glyn Dix was living alone, a single man in his 20s renting a flat from a young mum, Pia Overbury.
We know as a young man he's living in digs but not paying his rent. Now actually this is our first hint, I think, of just how disorganised and chaotic Glyn Dix's thinking processes actually are.
Glyn Dix was an unreliable tenant. He often paid his rent late, if at all.
This isn't a careless disregard. It's actually somebody whose mind doesn't work effectively, who doesn't really understand how the world works, doesn't understand how other people works. And this is our first hint of him struggling with functioning as an adult. He's just coping moment by moment.
Pia and her young daughters were forced to visit Dix's home to collect his late rent. His behaviour during these visits became increasingly erratic.
Pia's daughter was a young child at the time. Now, she recounts that when they used to go to try and collect rent, on the occasions when he would try and pay it, she would feel very uncomfortable in his presence. He would sometimes make strange faces at her.
I think it's very interesting that while the landlady herself doesn't identify anything sinister about Glyn Dix, her young daughter does find something frightening about him. That's very interesting because actually, in some ways, I think that the type of dangerousness that Glyn Dix presents is something that a child would better understand, would better relate to.
What Pia didn't realise was she was dealing with a ticking time bomb. And by the mere fact of asking to be paid for the rent that was due, she had placed herself very much in the firing line of that time bomb.
Pia is repeatedly frustrating him, causing immense frustration, and yet she won't have been aware of that because she won't have picked up on any of the personality indicators of somebody who is dangerous. So she's putting herself in incredible danger without realising it.
Unwittingly, Pia had ignited a furious rage in Glyn Dix, and he takes a dangerous step.
How dare she? Who does she think she is?
It was at that point he bought a gun.
We do know about people who revere weapons, display weapons, want to use weapons, are more dangerous than other people. So we start to get a picture of this man who likes to dominate, who likes to frighten, and now has an illegal gun.
In the early autumn of 1979, Pia Overbury disappeared. Her daughter, Maxine, wanting to celebrate her birthday, was the first to notice that her mother was missing.
They were going there to have a celebration of some type. However, Pia wasn't there. Now, this was starting to cause some real concern, so they reported her missing.
Pia's husband sensed something was wrong and reported her missing to the police, but they had little to go on. Neil Lancaster is a former police detective experienced in using technology to help trace missing persons, but back then, that was not an option.
There were no telephones to track. Banking information was always way out of date. There was no CCTV, so we were reliant on finding her, just looking for her. There were no leads. Now, I have to say that in those days, police treated missing person inquiries as differently. They used to think, well, maybe she's just gone, left her husband, and it was almost thought of as nobody else's business.
Dix watched silently from the sidelines throughout October. Police, neighbours and family searched for Pia. Mary Redfers had just moved to Gloucestershire. Their corner of the Forest of Dean was quiet and safe, the perfect place to raise her children.
I love the peacefulness of it, and in the spring it's full of bluebells. It's lovely, and it's a very, very old wood, this. It's called Carter's Grove because they used to stop here on the way to market where there was water for the cattle and spend the night here. I think that's what happened. But it's a very, very old wood. It's very special, and it's just beautiful.
The Forest of Dean, as Dix would have known, was also a perfect place to bury a body. On October 20th, Mary was walking through the grove. It was unseasonably warm, and Mary and her young children were exploring the area.
When my children were younger, we did come quite often, when the bluebells were out especially. But on that particular day, it was because of the young trees that I came. But it's lovely, and it's peaceful, and there's a lot of birds down here. And as you feel it's an ancient woodland somehow.
Mary saw something that haunts her to this day.
We were just on the way through. It was a bit overgrown, and then in front of me was this pile of branches.
Poorly hidden amongst the undergrowth, a woman's body. It was Pia Overbury.
I just saw these legs, which looked exactly as if they'd got lisle stockings on, sticking out under the branches. I thought, oh God, what on earth? And then I saw that I could see the head.
Trying not to panic the children, Mary got out of the woods as fast as she could.
When I realised what it was, my first thought was I must get the children out of here.
Glyn Dix had killed for the first time, but this man made for murder was far from finished. One day, he would marry Hazel.
Although he is perfectly capable of living out convincingly this romantic fantasy over a prolonged period of time with Hazel, that fantasy is always going to be precarious because he remains somebody who is not fully in touch with reality, who does not think in the same way that you or I think.
Mary Redfers raced home, frightened for her life.
This would have been a terrible shock for Mary, just going out for a walk with her children to find a body. She rushes straight off and raises the alarm.
I was frightened because you think, oh my gosh, is there somebody behind a tree, and you try not to get into a panic because you've got to move quickly without falling over or something. And with the two children, one of which was quite small, it was quite difficult.
Despite her fear, she remembers to mark the spot where she had stumbled on the body of Pia Overbury, so helping guide police to the gruesome scene.
I tied my green scarf onto one of the trees so we'd remember. Then, of course, when the police came, I knew exactly where it was.
This is now a murder inquiry. They are interviewing local residents, they're interviewing the tenants at the properties.
And they will interview Glyn Dix.
One person that they were inevitably going to speak to was the tenant with whom she had issues. He wasn't a prime suspect, no one was. He was just one of the people on the list.
After Pia's body is found, Dix becomes a suspect because she knew him, he was in debt to her, and he became more and more concerned about the suspicions of the police. He was interviewed, he didn't like that.
His reaction to being spoken to by the police was so extreme that he went from there, amongst everyone else, to the very top of the list of suspects.
Evidence begins to mount.
Well, there's a fingertip search going through the area where Pia's body was found. Now, this is a very meticulous exercise with a large number of officers on their hands and knees going through the undergrowth of that woodland. Now, during this, they find Pia's handbag. And more importantly than that, whilst going through, they find a .410 shotgun cartridge. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. This is evidence. This is really hard, crucial evidence, because a particular bullet, a particular cartridge, can be matched precisely and forensically to any particular firearm.
Pia's strange, unnerving tenant is now the prime suspect in her murder.
Now, Dix can't handle this. The stress is far too much for him.
Police arrive at his home to interview him under caution. Dix responds in dramatic fashion.
He takes an overdose and he's taken to hospital.
When he gets to hospital, his behaviour becomes really concerning. It's very erratic and strange. People start worrying that he's not thinking properly, responding properly. So he actually ends up in a psychiatric unit.
While in hospital, after his unsuccessful attempt to take his own life, police and doctors observe troubling signs of Dix's mental state.
His mind is literally flitting from one fictional narrative to another in response to whatever situation he finds in. There's no system, there's no organisation, there's no framework, there's no plan, there's no strategy within this individual.
He showed some symptoms looking like those of schizophrenia at that time.
Doctors agree to let police again question Dix. This time, he does not try to protest his innocence.
He broke down, he confessed, and he took them to where that firearm was.
Glyn Dix admitted to shooting his landlady, but his motive baffles police. Dix tells a confusing story of a contract killing gone wrong. He claims Pia had asked him to kill her husband. Then the story changes. Pia's marriage was abusive and he was trying to help her. Detectives realise that neither story is true. Expert analysts point to a man whose mental issues make him very dangerous.
Glyn Dix doesn't know who he is or what he is. All he has to present to the world are the narratives, the fiction, the stories he sees around and about. Now, so when he draws on one of these, he's able to act it out in a very effective manner because he is totally absorbed by it, believing it. It's all he is. So in a sense, it is genuine.
He truly believed that he was involved in a contract killing. So as his mental state deteriorated, he himself gave different explanations at different times as his mind shifted from increasingly bizarre and strange ideas.
Regardless of the motivation, police have their man.
The evidence is now overwhelming. They have Dix's confession. They have the firearm. He's taken them to it. He's shown them where it is. They have the bullet that they found at the scene, which is now forensically linked to that firearm. It's a slam dunk case. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, he has no alternative, and in July 1980 he pleads guilty to murder and is sentenced to life imprisonment.
It would be 20 years before he'd be considered for parole. While in jail, guards and inmates see a different side to Glyn Dix.
Now, all through his prison life, he seems to have stayed under the radar.
Now that's presumably because he was under medical supervision all the time and was taking his medication.
And although for some, being in prison makes the symptoms much worse, paradoxically, for some patients, they do actually improve. Sometimes the illness gets picked up and the circumstances in prison actually can be beneficial.
Maybe the prison system, with its routines and, lack maybe of external anxiety-producing sort of stimuli, maybe that suited him. Maybe he's very suited to that kind of prison environment.
Medicated, in a routine, Glyn Dix seems far from a natural-born killer.
It's very difficult to understand the type of danger that somebody like Glyn Dix poses, because it's not the type of danger we normally associate with violent murderers. He's not somebody with a hostile, aggressive, vindictive personality. He's not somebody who's looking to impose power or control over others and seeking opportunities for murder or being ready to act in a violent and aggressive way. That isn't who he is. He doesn't have that way of thinking in his head.
Andrew Fisher, QC, would one day represent Glyn Dix.
Mr. Dix was a long-term schizophrenic, and as is not uncommon with schizophrenics, they're fine when they're on their medication.
Dix was eventually moved to a minimum security jail, and so began the process which led to him meeting Hazel Griffin, mother of Adam, who was serving time for traffic offences. Grateful for a new friend, Adam introduces Dix to his mother.
So this is how he gets introduced to Hazel. They spark up a relationship.
And I think that's what we see with somebody like Glyn Dix. It's much harder to pick up on that potential when you're presented with somebody who really doesn't have the personality or the apparent motivation to murder.
Dix had not told Adam or Hazel the truth about Pia Overbury's death.
Dix tells her some quite bizarre stories about how Pia died.
Dix seemed determined to woo Hazel. Did he have an agenda?
He was probably thinking about what life was going to be like when he actually did get out of prison. He needed to start laying the groundwork for, where he was going to live, who was going to look after him, who was going to look after his every need. So in that way, he probably targeted Hazel. She may have been lonely. She may just have, again, been the victim of an arch manipulator.
Hazel did not know about the true nature of his crimes. The man who was now her fiancé is the man of her dreams. She wanted to believe what he was telling her.
Despite the fantastical nature of this elaborate, ridiculous story, Hazel was in too deep. She bought it, and she was taken in by it.
He's got no other focus in his life. He can focus everything on Hazel. He can make her feel like a queen. He can make her feel like she's the only person in his life, because the fact is, she is.
But I think it's entirely understandable that Hazel would not have seen anything dangerous or vindictive in Glyn, and instead would have seen a romantic, likeable individual, because in some ways that is what he was. That is the storyline that he would have been acting out in his relationship with her.
If Hazel or her family had any fears about the new man in her life, they pushed them aside and began planning an unconventional wedding.
On the 5th of September 1999, whilst Dix was on day release, he married his fiancée. They had a nice ceremony. Family report that this was a nice day. It was a pleasant wedding. He behaved like the perfect gentleman, and the family seemed to be coming round and accepting him.
2 years later, Glyn Dix was released, and the couple were finally able to begin their life together.
In 2001, after 20 years in prison, Dix is released on life licence. Now, this is not an entire release from prison. He is subject to recall at any second. Any small infraction on his conditions of release, he can be recalled to prison. So he would be living with this over his head like the sword of Damocles.
He had been medicated. He had received all of the treatment that he can receive. And as a society, we work on the basis that everyone's redeemable. And for 20 years, he proved himself redeemable. And so the system deemed him no longer dangerous, and the system released him. And as a person who works within that system, we have to accept that the system is not always right. And in this case, it was not right.
They settle down in a house in Redditch. He's completely accepted by the family, and they just seem like a normal married couple.
Everybody in the new couple's life seemed willing to accept Dix as a reformed man.
I don't think for a second he's changed. I think he's waiting for his opportunity to arise.
He'd killed before. Was Glyn Dix a man made for murder not once, but twice? If so, Hazel may have been ill-equipped to spot the signs.
I believe he wasn't in touch with reality. He was nonetheless not completely without intelligence, which is a strange combination, and which produced somebody who was able to convincingly live out a fantasy role with Hazel for a prolonged period of time.
Glyn Dix and Hazel began their married life in the Worcestershire town of Redditch. If their new neighbours were unaware of Glyn's history, there was nothing about his behaviour that would give him away.
They were described by everybody as being this absolutely wonderful couple. Not just Hazel. It wasn't, well, she's lovely, but look at the husband. They were very popular. They were very well regarded. Everyone thought that they were effectively the perfect couple. And they lived together as a perfect couple for 3 years.
He was carrying on with his life very properly. There was no question, for instance, of any domestic violence or any trouble between he and his wife, Hazel. Indeed, they were regarded by everyone as being the perfect couple, the lovey-dovey couple.
For 2 years, Hazel and Glyn Dix lived happily together. But without prison doctors monitoring his mental health, how long could that last?
In my opinion, he hasn't changed at all. The medication may be keeping a lid on him, but to me, he's just a bomb waiting to go off.
He thought that he was well, and plainly he'd stopped taking his medication.
I think in probably the last year they were together, his mind is progressively deteriorating and he's getting sicker and sicker. And sadly, nobody's picking this up.
In fact, life as a free man came with new challenges, ones that Dix had not faced in his 20 years of incarceration.
I would question whether the relationship was functioning normally. There's lots of things we know about Dix which suggest that could never happen. I think that To live with, Hazel would have found him challenging and difficult. But he had on his side that he'd spent the last 20 years in prison. Perfect excuse for all these strange behaviours that she probably thought, yeah, fair enough, he needs to readjust. He's had a difficult life. The outside is something new to him.
He's in a new environment. He stopped taking his medication. Did Hazel know? Probably not. So she would not have known of the growing danger that she faced from her husband, the killer.
It's not uncommon for people who are on long-term medication that their partners or those who live with them don't necessarily know whether they're taking the medication, whether they're taking the proper dosage at the right time. And it may well be that his wife was alert to that, but she may not have realised quite how ill he was or what the effects of that would be.
Although he is perfectly capable of living out convincingly this romantic fantasy over a prolonged period of time with Hazel, that fantasy is always going to be precarious because he remains somebody who is not fully in touch with reality, who does not think in the same way that you or I think. And that distortion of reality, that lack of rational thought can be exposed and will be exposed in sudden and surprising and overwhelming ways.
Hazel's son Adam may also have been oblivious to how unhinged his stepfather had become, until, that is, one humid, stormy afternoon 3 years after Dix's release from prison.
On Saturday the 19th of June 2004, his old cellmate, Adam, goes to visit his mum at Seymour Drive in Redditch.
And he can't get in. So he knocks the door, there's no answer, and so he phones. And Dix answers the phone and says, "Oh yeah, come round the back, come on in."
The gate's locked, which is unusual because it never is. So he phones the house. Dix answers the phone and says, "Yeah, I'm in, come round." So he does go round.
He came round to the back of the house, looked through the kitchen window where he saw Mr. Dix.
The sight that greeted him was frankly absolutely horrific.
Adam is met with a scene of utter carnage. Dix is naked. There is blood everywhere.
Terrified of what he might see on the other side of the door, Adam makes his way into his mum's kitchen.
Adam came round the back of the house, having been out, looked through the kitchen door, which was glazed or semi-glazed, saw Mr. Dix naked, astride something and lots of blood, and only realised what it was when he saw his mother's severed head on the kitchen floor.
Dix had killed Hazel, but not only had he killed her, he had dismembered and mutilated her body and was still in the process of interacting with Hazel's body, naked himself, covered in blood.
His mother has been murdered and dismembered. Her body parts are in bags. Her heart is in the freezer. A scene of unimaginable horror.
It was a scene that defied belief, as did Dix's words when Adam walked into the room.
When Dix is aware that Adam is in the kitchen with him, he looks at him and simply says, "We've had an argument."
He says that the reason that he killed Hazel was that they had an argument over the TV channel.
One of them wanted to watch the football, one of them wanted to watch the wrestling.
It's almost like he's getting some perverse joy from, look at the chaos that I've done, that I'm in the middle of, and see how I'm belittling it by saying, "Oh, it's just an argument, what's your problem?"
Suddenly, this unimportant source of annoyance exposes the psychotic aspect of Glyn Dix, and we see him responding as he did previously in this impulsive, instinctive way to a very simple, very trivial annoyance. Suddenly we see that this is not somebody who is grounded in reality.
Adam fled the house in horror, called the police. They were on the scene in minutes.
Dix appears relaxed, unfazed, calm. It's almost like this is normal. He doesn't try to run away, he doesn't try to flee. He just sits and waits.
He admitted his responsibility, absolutely. There was no question of him trying to get out of it at all.
And in the aftermath of the murder, we see very clearly just how mentally ill Glyn Dix is. We find him chopping up the woman he has apparently loved for a number of years into little pieces and talking about the fact that they've had a little argument.
But when officers arrived, Dix told them something else, something that made even less sense.
He said that she liked things tidy, and he was cleaning up. Now, two statements. One is he says he's been provoked by an argument over a TV channel. The second, he says something which to most people, apart from a psychiatrist, is totally bizarre. He says he is tidying up. He's standing with a knife in his hand when Adam finds him. He's covered in blood, and there are Hazel body parts about.
Whilst this seems a frenzied, brutal, horrific attack, which it clearly is, there also seems to be an element of thought, of care, of a systematic approach by Dix to this unimaginable horror.
In dismembering the body, he says that he was tidying up. He's doing this because she liked things tidy. Now, that is a particular form of thinking that you see in some patients when they are really severe and acutely psychotic. It's a sort of form of distortion of the logic. So it's logical to him, but actually he's killing her, he's dismembering her body. And there's something almost dreamlike about it.
With Dix taken into secure custody, officers were able to examine the scene and what remained of 54-year-old Hazel's body. They would need to make sense of the carnage that they surveyed before deciding what to do with Glyn Dix. Was this man in the midst of a psychotic breakdown, or was there something even darker going on?
Subsequently, there have been a lot of indications that this may be far worse than that, far more ritualistic than that, because there are a lot of indications that, in fact, as part of Glyn Dix's schizophrenia, he had developed an extreme form of Satanism.
So the ritualistic, Satanistic material that we know he was exposed to would have been incredibly destructive and powerful and would have taken a real hold on his mind.
Just 5 years after their unconventional jailhouse wedding, Glyn and Hazel Dix's marriage ended in brutality.
What we know is that in the course of a normal domestic day, something triggers Glyn Dix to stab Hazel and then to effectively chop her body up. Almost ritual butchery.
Was this inevitable? A key question for investigators was whether Glyn Dix was so mentally damaged that he did not know what he was doing, that his illness made him kill Hazel. So technically, he might not be guilty of murder. It matters in cases like that of Glyn Dix. The answer might reduce an offence to manslaughter, offering the remotest possibility that he may be released again at some time in the distant future. Evidence of planning would suggest murder rather than manslaughter. Was that available?
Whilst this was clearly a horrifically frenzied attack that caused such carnage, such devastating, unmitigated horror, there were elements and evidence here of a systematic approach.
He had taken Hazel's heart, he had taken it from her body, and he had placed it in the freezer.
The placement of the tools, the way the body was decapitated, the way the head was removed, the way the organs were removed. This shows an unbelievable attitude to this act of killing.
Dix told police he'd done that to preserve his wife.
There's just a glimpse of his awareness that he's done something really bad. In the way he says, we've had a little argument. The way in which he's chopping up the body is like a child chopping up plasticine. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, we really see just how far away from reality his understanding of the world is.
Police began to notice other possible motives behind Dix's actions.
there is a Satanist salute which involves the two outer fingers. And when he was cutting up Hazel's body, Glyn Dix formed her hand into that salute by removing the fingers that weren't part of the salute.
He's described as painting bizarre paintings on the wall that have sinister implication.
He had done some very strange things, especially in artwork and things around the house.
He's been reading the book of Revelations. Interesting how often Revelation seems to feature in the minds of people with schizophrenia when they become severely psychotic.
The more emotionally stimulating, the more physically arousing, the more dramatic, the more primitive the imagery or the influence that he's exposed to, the more powerful an effect it would have had on somebody like Glyn Dix. So the ritualistic, Satanistic material that we know he was exposed to would have been incredibly destructive and powerful and would have taken a real hold on his mind.
It's quite likely that at one stage he actually identified himself as the Beast 666, and so he actually has to carry out what he has read about in the most awful, graphic way for the evil one. And so that is what's actually driving him.
Had Dix willingly become a follower of Satan, or was he a victim of his own damaged mind? Perhaps both. Imagery that he had painted on walls was revealing to Donna Young's. They suggest a weak, deeply susceptible mind.
Images like the dragon that we know he had a huge image of in his kitchen, in the room where he murdered Hazel. Images like that, characters like that, give life to, give a way of activating the adult feelings that he has had no capacity to go forward with. The moment he was exposed to any images, ideas, influences, stories that in any way glorified or presented as exciting or arousing violence, then I think at some stage it was inevitable that he would act that material out.
When he took on Glyn Dix's case, barrister Andrew Fisher too believed firmly that his client was suffering from a break with reality. He was mad, not bad.
I was first instructed, I would think a few weeks after the murder had taken place. It was plain that he was severely mentally ill.
It was Fisher who pushed for Dix to undergo psychiatric assessment.
The very facts of the offence itself were so bizarre and unusual that it could only have been committed by someone who was seriously mentally ill, in my view. I'm not a doctor, but that was my amateur view. And so my instructing solicitors, though, had already obtained a medical report, but that report had been obtained from the hospital that had released him from his previous sentence. And it suggested that there was nothing wrong with him.
This may have been true in 2001 when Hazel met Dix and a parole board had signed off on his release from prison.
Essentially, to get out, he's going to have to show that he is mentally stable and demonstrate that he no longer poses a risk to the public.
But Dix was taking regular medication under the supervision of prison guards.
The medication would have been to keep his illness suppressed.
Without drugs, as he was when on the outside, Dix was a killer.
That had its effect, that the schizophrenia coming back, and became severely mentally ill and became psychotic.
There was a lot of evidence to suggest that Dix had been so deranged that his actions when killing Hazel were not those of a sane person. But as the case was about to begin, with the vital question to be debated in court, Glyn Dix was not interested in using his apparent insanity to defend his actions.
I went and had a conference with him at Long Lartin prison where he was being held in custody. And again, he was utterly mortified. He didn't really wish to discuss it. He just kept on repeating how much he regretted it and how sorry he was. As his legal representatives, we weren't sure that that was the right outcome. So the options were, he was either guilty of murder, providing he knew what he was doing and he had proper responsibility for what he was doing, or he was guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility because his responsibility was diminished by reason of his mental illness, or he was not guilty by reason of insanity because he just didn't know what he was doing.
It's very obvious to me that he was floridly psychotic, and the insanity is a legal term.
What happened was, when the first hearing before the court, I informed the judge that we, meaning the whole of his legal team, were not satisfied about his mental health, and therefore we needed reports before we could progress with the case. But Mr. Dix himself wasn't having any of that, and he stood up in the dock and then told the judge he was pleading guilty, admitted the offence, and that that was that.
On the 16th of December 2005, a judge at Birmingham Crown Court accepted Glyn Dix's guilty plea.
The judge then stated that he took the view that he couldn't prevent the defendant from pleading guilty, even though we weren't satisfied about his mental health.
The judge's primary concern is that Dix is of a major risk to the public. But I think that most people looking at this case will say, my goodness me, he's done it 20 years ago and he's gone and done it again. So the judge's main concern is that he is to protect the public. Now, the best way to be entirely sure is to give him a whole life sentence.
All the time, of course, it was acknowledged that there was no way that he would ever be released from whatever institution he was held in, whether it was a hospital or a prison. If he'd been found not guilty by reason of insanity, he would have been sent to a mental hospital with a restriction not to be released, other than with the consent of the Home Secretary, who would never agree to release him, obviously, because of his history and the fact he previously committed a killing before this one.
He now becomes one of the few convicted British criminals who will never, ever see the light of day again.
Shortly after his sentencing, prison authorities reached the same conclusion as barrister Andrew Fisher. Jail was not the right place for Glyn Dix.
Prison authorities immediately said, this man's seriously mentally ill, and he was shipped off to Ashworth Hospital, which is one of the special hospitals, one of the three special hospitals, Broadmoor, Rampton and Ashworth in Liverpool. On his reception into Ashworth Hospital, they realised he was seriously mentally ill.
I believe that Dix ended up in the right place.
Hazel left behind 6 children who never truly got the answers they deserved for why Dix did what he did. Had she unwittingly married a man who was naturally made for murder? Perhaps. Or perhaps he was one highly susceptible to the wrong influences.
In his rawest form, no, he doesn't have the personality traits or the aggressive interpersonal styles or the desire to cause pain. He doesn't have that. And yet, because of the susceptibility of his mind, because he has no contact with reality, Glyn Dix did and always does represent a danger to anybody in contact with him. At any moment, a seemingly unimportant source of frustration can and could trigger an impulsive, defensive, aggressive reaction.
Whatever the reason, the scars left by Hazel's brutal murder have never healed.
Tragically, 10 years after this event, Adam died. He never got over this. We must imagine what it must have been like for him to see his mother for the last time in the circumstances which he did. He never recovered, and he died aged 39.
One can't possibly envisage what effect that must have on someone for the rest of their lives. I don't imagine he was able ever to get past that.
In accordance with his whole life tariff, Glyn Dix spent the remainder of his life securely incarcerated in Ashworth High Security Hospital. He died there in 2014 at the age of 60.
was terrified of
The voice of David Roustaby, not a man to cross.
Roustaby hated everything and everyone. He hated the world, he hated life. That was part of who he was.
Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. David Roustaby was brought up in care homes. He had failed to develop any sort of consistent work, lived in a tawdry bedsit, and blamed anyone but himself for his lifestyle. Forensic psychologist Donna Youngs has been analysing the state of mind of Roustaby around the year 2007.
Somewhere along the line, Roustaby develops two of the most negative, destructive personal life narratives that we know about. He develops a narrative that's all about revenge. Somewhere along the line, he decides that he has been wronged, and he becomes this individual fueled by anger and hatred of other people. At the same time, he also develops this total nihilism. For him, life becomes completely meaningless, and so he's on a complete mission of self-destruction. Now, the combination of these two narratives is incredibly dangerous, because you have somebody fueled by hatred of other people at the same time as somebody who just no longer wants really to be part of the world. Put those two together and you get a very dangerous individual.
By contrast, David Clarke, who would one day live in the same building as Roustaby, was a man who made friends easily.
The people who knew David Clarke spoke of a man who was a generally kind and generous person.
He was described as chatty, very talkative. One witness would describe him in the morning, sat at the window and would wave at her when she passed and was leaving.
Angela Hunter met David Clarke when she was out shopping. A long courtship was about to begin.
In the late 80s, I decided to buy a moped, and the person that served me at my chosen venue was David. And then sometime during 2001, quite a few years later, he tracked me down and we struck up a friendship again, which then developed into a relationship, and we ended up getting married in August of 2003.
But by 2006, aged 41, he had been reduced in mind and body by addiction.
He was always a drinker when we were having our relationship and so to speak, courting. But it wasn't until later on that I realised the extent of it. And he was actually very good at hiding a lot of it.
David's addiction changed his personality. He was a difficult drunk. Angela had little option but to act.
I ended up getting a court order, a restraining order against him, because I couldn't cope with it anymore. I had tried to help him. We had reached out to various organisations within the NHS to try and get him help for his addiction. I think he wanted to beat the alcoholism. He just didn't have the support and the strength to do it.
It was David's sad addiction which drove him into the hands of David Roustaby. It was in 2006 when David moved to a bedsit on the edge of the city where Roustaby also lived.
If you look at the house from the outside, you wouldn't know it was a house of multiple occupation. And I understand now it's got 6 or 7 flats, and I think in those days it was 10 or 11. He just literally had a room in this house.
Roustaby was a man with an ugly past, one littered with crimes.
David Roustaby grew up in local authority care. We know that he began drinking around the age of 12. He began drinking excessively around the age of 16, and he also got into a lot of trouble during his teenage years. There are criminal convictions for theft and arson.
In 2002, when he was aged 26, he was arrested for assault upon a police officer. A quite severe assault. It was an actual bodily harm. Actual bodily harm means there has to be some bruising. And to be charged with actual bodily harm on a police officer, it's normally fairly significant. In the back of the car, somehow he managed to get in the back of a car with a starter's pistol. And he fired a starter's pistol in the back of the car, which he was also charged with.
In the 2002 instance, where there was a discharge, massively impacted on other people's lives, very unpleasant. I can't speak for the officer, but certainly, the officer was doing her duty.
Roustaby was arrested again not long after his release from prison in 2004. He had brandished a replica gun in front of a teenager on Windmill Lane in York, sparking a siege. In 2005, he repeated his behaviour at another location in the city.
We established that David Roustaby, I think, had a bit of a fascination with firearms. But that's had a massive ripple effect on the community because actually nobody wants to have that there because they think it's a safe place to live.
This shows a complete refusal to buy into any of the social norms, any of the rules of society. It's someone who's sticking two fingers up at the world, for whom nothing makes any sense. That's a clear indication. Now, when nothing makes sense for anyone, that shows us that deep within that person is an emptiness, which is dangerous.
So this was the man who, in 2006, David Clarke had become acquainted with. Roustaby shared the property where both had bedsits. Polar opposites in personality, David Roustaby found common ground.
David Roustaby lived on the bottom floor, David Clarke lived above, and they would quite often go to each other's flat, have drinks together.
They spent a lot of time together, drinking alcohol together in one another's bedrooms, and that was really the genesis of their friendship.
Roustaby would sometimes be seen helping his alcohol-addled neighbour.
But if David Clarke got so drunk that he couldn't get him up the stairs, David Roustaby would then manage to carry him up the stairs.
Ostensibly friends, Roustaby could turn violent.
In 2006, there was an incident which we argued was part of the motive for the killing. And in that incident, an argument developed between the two men, and David Roustaby produced a blank-firing pistol and discharged it in the bedroom in the presence of David Clarke.
It would appear that basically they had a conversation in the flat on that night. David Roustaby produced this gun from what David Clarke said was a safe, and obviously then discharged it up by his head.
A gun which fires blanks can still be frightening.
David Clarke made a report to the police. He also very quickly tried to retract that report and said that he didn't think David Roustaby would ever have hurt him. And so it really went nowhere in terms of the police investigation.
Well, the fact that he'd gone to the police about the incident didn't surprise me. That would be something that David would do. The fact that he's retracted the statement after the fact, that did surprise me. I wondered at that point whether he was coerced into it.
It was cold, grey and muddy underfoot when York GP Alfred Wiseman took off for a walk by the river with his 4 dogs. He could see something in the water where it was shallow.
Just walked across this field here, saw something in the river. As I got closer, I realised it was a body. It's found on the far bank, or near the far bank, by those 2 big white stones. Head downstream.
Nothing could be done to save the man that Dr. Wiseman had found lying in the river.
It's certainly an unusual finding. It's not something you see every day. But it didn't disturb me. I mean, I knew there's no way he was going to be anywhere near alive or even resuscitatable.
How had the dead man got there?
My initial thoughts was looking at the position of the body, where we were. I thought it was a drunk trying to walk across a parapet on the bridge and had fallen off and ended up in the water.
15 minutes later, police arrived. A major incident was declared.
They couldn't understand why this person, who was unidentified at this time, had been located in the river. He was fully clothed. The way he was laid face down into the water, he was only partially submerged. There was no water going across his head, but it was very much a case of he was sort of partially submerged, with his left hand underneath his body and his palm facing up, coming out the right-hand side of his body, and then a mobile phone some distance away from him in the centre of the river.
A large police team deployed to the area. Police divers were called in to search the river and the riverbed, and they recovered from the middle of the stream the mobile telephone of David Clarke.
Police at that early stage had not established that the man whose life had descended from happily married and loving partner to broken alcoholic had been living in the same building as David Roustaby. They also didn't know that Roustaby was angry with the world.
the seething, gnawing, constant hatred of everything and everyone, in combination with the recklessness, the what the hell way he had of seeing the world, those two factors were always going to cause the downfall of somebody.
Had David Clarke been killed by a man made for murder? Early police theories suggested that David Clarke had been drunk when he had fallen into the river.
David Clarke's death had been investigated at the time that his body had been found, and it had been investigated by a senior police team who had considered whether it might be a suspicious death. One of the things that had happened is that a Home Office pathologist had conducted a post-mortem and concluded that David Clarke had probably drowned.
They discovered that his blood alcohol was massive.
Angela Hunter, David's wife, was at home when police knocked at her door.
In April 2007, a man and a woman got out of the car, knocked on the front door. They introduced themselves as police detectives, and they wanted to talk to me about David, and they started talking to me about the last time I'd seen him and his whereabouts and what have you. And during the conversation, they suddenly realised that I didn't know that he'd been found dead that morning, at which point they had to tell me. And the rest of that conversation, for me, I have to say, is a blur.
Police strongly suspected that David's death was accidental. David's family disagreed.
David was used to drinking, and David was what they considered to be a high-functioning drunk because he could keep going when he was drinking. But even he, I don't think, with that level of alcohol, would have managed to walk all the way 3.5 miles to where he was found.
So we're here in the outskirts of York, and from here to Huntington Road, it's about 4.6 miles. And to have walked that seems quite impossible. If you are familiar with the road conditions, there's lots of narrow roads and bends. The visibility isn't great. If you walk at night, there's a high chance that you could probably get hit by a car. Given the state Mr. Clarke was in, he was heavily intoxicated at the time. To have walked 4.6 miles seems a bit bizarre.
Well, you have to consider that David Clarke was an alcoholic, and yet his body was found many miles away from his bedsit, which required him to have walked out of York into open countryside at night for no good reason.
An inquest was held. Alcohol was considered part of the story of David's death, but it was not thought to be a case of murder.
They thought it was drowning by accident, but we just knew that wasn't the case.
The death of David Clarke was a mystery.
Initial cause of death was given as an open verdict because he couldn't establish how he'd got to that location. The pathological evidence was that he died from drowning whilst under the influence of alcohol, and he also had diazepam in his system as well, David Clarke, when he died. And obviously he was 4 times over the legal limit.
The inquest, from memory, only took about 30 minutes. It was so cold and official, and it was just, because we turned up to go to, to the inquest to hear it, and it was just seemed to be done in a flash. That's it, he's drowned. Move on. As far as I can remember, we had no contact with the police, no contact with the coroners. There was nothing. I didn't even get to register the death. They just sent me death certificates. That was it. But he definitely didn't get the investigation. It should have been a murder hunt right from the get-go, but it wasn't.
It was acknowledged that there were anomalies surrounding the way David had died. Though people can drown in shallow water, at this point in the river, the depth of the water was minimal.
As you can tell, the water here isn't very deep, only a few inches. He was fully clothed, and he was found lying face down.
As the police said, he either had to lift his head or roll over to be able to breathe. If you are compos mentis or sober, not so drunk, don't know which words you want to use, to be able to walk all the way over there, if you did happen to trip up and fall in the river, you're still going to be in a fit state to lift your head. unless you've knocked yourself out, obviously, but there was no sense from what we were told then that he'd knocked himself out.
There were other factors which implied David's death was related to his lifestyle. Diazepam, a drug to treat anxiety, was found in his bloodstream. But as quickly as a possible explanation for his death was considered, it was rejected. David's wife could not accept that diazepam had played a part.
The diazepam apparently was prescribed to him by his doctor, but David had subsequently told the doctor that there was no intention he was going to use it.
Had David taken his own life? Choosing that option by drowning in the fosse appeared illogical.
David Clarke lived in a house that backed on to the River Fosse in the centre of York, where it's a much deeper and faster moving river. If he'd wanted to hurt himself, he had many, many ways of doing that, either with the tablets he had in his flat, or with alcohol, or by throwing himself into the river. So the proposition that he would walk for miles into the middle of nowhere and then somehow fall into a shallow stream and drown or kill himself was ridiculous.
Angela continued to suspect that her husband had been murdered, but for 12 years no further investigation took place. There was no proof that he had been killed. But if he had been, his killer had got away with it. Until police took a phone call in 2019 from a couple who claimed they had made a secret recording of a murder confession, one allegedly made by David's former neighbour, David Roustaby.
In 2019, North Yorkshire Police were contacted by a couple who advised us they had a CCTV recording of themselves and David at their home address.
5 in the drink, but my eyes okay.
The man and woman had been partying with Roustaby and decided to secretly record him as he boasted of the murder.
And I think when it was first reported to the police, they probably thought that this was going to turn out to be a bit of a wild goose chase. But then when they listened to the confession and realised it did relate to the death of David Clarke and that he had in fact been found in the River Fosse, suddenly it became much more serious.
I invited him into my flat, I sat him down, 5 in the drink, went up to his flat, got his medication, helped his drawer, got a load of his drugs, pushed them all up, put them in the drink.
And in the course of conversation, he began to admit to them that he had murdered David Clarke many years earlier.
Got my eyes okay, should tie around his neck, strangled him.
For once, Roustaby is with people who aren't apparently just rejecting him. That's why we see the attempt to engage with them and impress them and the boasting to the couple and trying to establish some kind of relationship.
In boasting, Roustaby revealed things which fitted with the facts around the discovery of the body of David Clarke.
He named him as David, named the river, and then obviously talked through the whole mechanics of how he actually killed him.
By strangling him to death, and transporting his body to the River Fosse and depositing it in the river.
Why, 12 years after killing David Clarke, would Roustaby kiss and tell all? By doing so, he revealed part of his character.
He thinks the way to earn their friendship is by boasting about just how nasty he can be.
The couple, friends of Roustaby till this point, contacted the police.
They felt a sense of perhaps duty or wanting to help, but obviously they gave that over to the police. That's when we had the confession of David Roustaby on CCTV, which was visual and audio, which is very, very rare.
Police had to consider, was the man telling the truth?
It's not unusual for people to confess to criminal offences in circumstances where they haven't committed them. We see all sorts of people in the criminal justice system, and people who confess for attention, or people who are effectively bragging to somebody they want to impress.
He wanted to boast that he'd murdered someone. He needed to tell people that he had killed someone and he'd got away with murder.
It's certainly not something that I have come across at all in my last 20 years.
Angela Hunter had waited for a full-scale murder investigation for 12 years. One was about to begin. Had David Clarke been murdered? And if so, was his killer David Roustaby? The 2007 investigation into the death of David Clarke did not consider Roustaby as involved because David Roustaby had an alibi for that evening. He was on a date.
David Roustaby, in an interview, chose to no comment all the questions apart from saying they had tea together at his girlfriend's house. He'd alibied himself out.
David Roustaby was asked about David Clarke. He said that they had been friends, and he said that he hadn't seen him after a certain time the night before and had no part at all to play in his death.
Roustaby had killed David Clarke and for 12 years remained unsuspected. His alibi then was his alibi as the case was reopened. Would a man made for murder get away with it again? Events of 2007 were being reviewed.
With any investigation, whenever you have an identified person, obviously the initial inquiry is to establish whether the death is natural, whether death is self-harm, or if there's any suspicious circumstances involved. There's always the element of how have they got here, how have they come to die, any third-party involvement. So it's very much a case of trying to build the picture slowly and trying to understand who the person is. For me, it's about trying to understand that person, and you can understand perhaps how they've died or how they came to be where they were found.
Questioned by police in the original investigation into the death of David Clarke, David Roustaby freely admitted that he had indeed been drinking with David Clarke on the night of the 17th of April 2007. They were pals after all, or were they?
So they became some kind of friends. They certainly became drinking buddies. And although on the surface they might have appeared to have an amicable relationship, I have no doubt that actually Roustaby despised David Clarke, and in particular would have looked down upon his weakness.
And when the police asked where he was that night, Roustaby said, well, I did go for a drink with him, yes, but only quickly. And then I spent the rest of the night with his partner. They live in the room next door.
Roustaby's then partner would one day help the police.
She would meet David Clarke, and there was, again, very much a sort of a friendship there. And from other people who would visit the flat, they would quite often be in each other's flats and just be drinking together and just generally socialising.
There were some reports that Roustaby would not always approve of the affability that Clarke showed towards Roustaby's partner.
David Roustaby had some jealousy in terms of how David Clarke behaved towards his then girlfriend.
There was no intimation that it was anything other than a friendship. We know from other witnesses in the house, again, that David Clarke would speak very openly to the people and have nice conversations.
And that plainly came between the friendship of the two men.
It was a working theory that potentially they had fought, because we knew they did it sort of irritate each other occasionally, but then what neighbours and friends don't irritate each other, but then it doesn't always necessarily lead to murder, which I'd hope it wouldn't.
On the 19th of April, the day after David's body had been found, Roustaby's partner called the police. She was about to help Roustaby cover up his crime.
She reported her car, a red Ford Fiesta, stolen to North Yorkshire Police. That car was recovered at Water End in York, not a considerable distance away from the home address. The following day, the 20th of April, when that was examined, it was found that there had been an attempt to set fire to it, and it had suffered damage to the driver's side door. However, it looked as though there was no ignition damage in it at the time.
The fact there was no ignition damage was an important piece of evidence. Most hot-wired cars at that time would have shown ignition damage. Nevertheless, Roustaby's lover stuck to her story.
She gave an account that the car had been stolen from the drive of her home. So the police noted that, and then the car was found a very short distance away on the outskirts of York, having been set on fire. The fire hadn't completely destroyed the car, but it had been a determined effort to try and destroy the interior, with crunched up magazines used to light seats of fire on the seats of the car.
Given the rarity of such a crime, this was another anomaly, but that fact did not form enough evidence back in 2007 to take the investigation further. Over the years that followed, the heavy drinker Roustaby seemed to settle.
we found with the investigation, we know that from sort of 2007, from the point that David Clarke obviously was being located, David Roosterby had not been in trouble with the police at all.
Until 2019, when his drunken confession to the murder of a man, which appeared to describe the death of David Clarke, led to the investigation being opened again. Why had Rowsterby owned up to a couple in York with whom he was involved in a relationship? And would police now get enough evidence to secure a prosecution? The 2019-2020 investigation was to hear and see evidence which spoke to the awfulness of Rowsterby's crime.
Watching the initial footage of the CCTV of this confession is that you have to try and understand why somebody's giving that confession, and it was a case of actually going away and pulling the original file from 2007. So it was a case of trying to build the jigsaw. We had one half, perhaps a picture, but we needed to sort of make sure that all the pieces sort of parallel with each other.
He knew David Clarke liked to drink. He got him drunk and he crushed up his tablets and put them into his drink to make him incapable of defending himself.
Got my eyes okay.
And when David Clarke was incapacitated in that way, he took a tie and he strangled him to death with it on the bed.
It's a murder fueled by absolute hatred of everything and everyone. In the way that he carries out the murder, he wants to see the pain, he wants to see the suffering of his victim. This is absolutely fueled by this gnawing hatred, this narrative of complete hatred of everything and everyone. And then, to top it all off, we have this careless dismissal of the body, this throwing away of the body in the river where it's easily discovered, as if it were a piece of rubbish, this total disrespect for the human being that David Clarke was, even after his death. We're not dealing with somebody who doesn't understand the world and the way that the world works and how to present himself as innocent. He knows that, he understands, he just doesn't care.
Hence his willingness to boast during his recorded confession, one which convinced police that Rowsterby was almost certainly a killer.
There were certain physical aspects that David Rowsterby mentioned in his confession which were not widely reported, if reported at all, and that obviously piqued the interest of North Yorkshire Police.
So when Mr. Clarke's body was found, there was a number of details that were only known to the police, and no one else except for the murderer could have known about this. One thing in particular were strangulation marks around the neck.
It had been thought during the original investigation that marks around David's neck could be explained by the way blood had gathered, but there was now new evidence. Could the marks have been because of a ligature being applied to David Clarke's neck?
It was a huge part of the investigation, putting the new account to the pathologist and saying, is this possible?
And we went back to the pathologist, and this was crucial. Went back to the pathologist, the original pathologist, and said, look, if you'd been given this information at the time that somebody had confessed to strangling him with a ligature, would you have still concluded that this was a drowning? Or were your findings on post-mortem examination consistent with ligature strangulation?
And for the pathologist to say, yes, it is, it takes the investigation on another level again, because it's a hard thing to do and go back and challenge pathological evidence, because actually, in effect, you're saying, based on this information, that finding may be wrong.
North Yorkshire Police asked the original pathologist in the death of David Clarke to revisit his evidence. Was it possible that he may have come to a different conclusion about the manner of death now that there were new facts to consider?
The police were able to put the confession to the pathologist and ask them their opinion. The opinion then came back that actually that could be the way in which could be the way in which David Clarke had been killed.
Technological advances allowed the 2020 detectives to uncover the text messages between Mr. Clarke and Rowsterby on the night of David Clarke's death.
In those text messages, David Rowsterby told David Clarke that he was feeling a little depressed. I believe the exact words were, "No family, no friends. It's a cruel world, not for me."
The first message was from David Rowsterby, and it implied that David Rowsterby was depressed and needing some sort of moral support from a friend. And the reply from David Clarke could be read as David Clarke saying that he would come round to David Roustaby's flat, or David Roustaby could come to his flat and they would have a chat.
So the murder is actually one of the more psychologically nastier murders that I've actually seen. It's a combination of this total exploitation of the vulnerability of David Clarke. We know that having premeditated the murder, he seizes upon David Clarke's message saying that he's feeling depressed and down to invite him over for a drink.
That the text message that David Roustaby sent had effectively been in order to lure David Clarke into meeting up with him.
Was David Roustaby about to be exposed as a man made for murder? It had taken 12 years, but was David Clarke about to get justice?
He didn't deserve to have his life taken from him. He was only 45.
Inquiries in 2020 revealed more of the frictions that came between Roustaby and Clarke.
They would drink together, according to David Roustaby, 2 times a week, excessively. They got into silly little arguments over the course of their strange friendship.
David Roustaby certainly had a temper, and there was a general pattern of him behaving in quite a bullying manner, and there was a sense in which he was bullying David Clarke and taking advantage of him.
He could sort of be threatening, be sort of perhaps intimidating, and give that persona out.
2020 detectives are also reminded of the fact that David Roustaby was capable of using firearms. His violence was extreme.
Obviously, that was an occasion when David Roustaby was arrested for threats to kill against David Clarke, where he threatened him with a firearm, and obviously he did obviously frighten David Clarke enough to report it to the police.
Roustaby's confession could have been the pompous boasts of a drunk. One by one, the assumptions of the previous inquiry would have to be dismissed. David Clarke had been drinking the night of his death. He had been prescribed medication.
We could prove that David Clarke did have traces of diazepam in his body when he was found. We could prove that he was prescribed those tablets at the time that he died. We could also prove from his medical records that he told his doctors that he never took them because he didn't like the effect of them.
Roustaby had described in his secretly recorded confession how he had got diazepam into David's system.
Got a lot of his drugs, pushed them all up, took them in drink.
We know that he then slips diazepam into his drink. It's a totally cowardly way of making his target, his victim, easier to attack. It's a cowardly murder, picking on him at his point of vulnerability and then rendering him even more vulnerable with the drugs.
DCI Holden explored the report about the stolen Ford Fiesta from 2007, the one owned by Roustaby's partner. How true was her claim? The stolen Ford Fiesta appeared to be, in fact, the car which would have been needed to drive the 4 miles from the house where all 3 had been on the night of David's murder. The trip to the riverside, where his body was found, needed a car. Almost 13 years to the day of her husband's death, Angela received another knock at the door.
April 2020, they came and told me that they were now investigating David's death as a murder, and they had 2 people. And through all of that, and the fact that they kept coming to us every couple of weeks, it was like a process. It wasn't grieving. It was just a process of what we were going through, because I grieved 13 years before.
From my perspective, going to tell the family some 13 years later that you've arrested somebody that morning on suspicion of murder is a huge thing for family, because they weren't aware of the investigation up until the point that I decided to arrest Roustaby.
In police custody, David Roustaby was anything but helpful.
He provided a prepared statement to the police saying that he never intended to harm or caused harm to David Clarke.
His partner, however, crumpled under interrogation.
She did answer part of the questions. She did accept that she had been involved in taking the body of David Clarke to the car and driving it to the river and helping to dispose of it.
Roustaby's alibi had disappeared.
David Roustaby was charged with murder. The case had been constantly reviewed, and we were more than satisfied that there was a realistic prospect of conviction.
Angela stoically sat in on proceedings in the court every day.
Every morning before the court started, I would have a little meeting with the prosecution counsel, Richard Wright, and with the police officer that was there to look after me, which most days was Nicola. But they'd have a meeting with me every morning, the two of them, just to say, this is what's going to happen today.
Despite what appeared overwhelming evidence, Roustaby did not confess.
Well, David Roustaby did not help the police at any stage of this investigation, and indeed did not help David Clarke's family at any stage of the trial. At every stage, he denied having any involvement in David Clarke's death. He ran the defence of alibi. He said he'd spent the night with his girlfriend. He disputed all of the main strands of the prosecution evidence, and he showed no expression of remorse or regret at all for what he'd done.
From the witness box, David Roustaby continued his denials surrounding David Clarke's death.
David Roustaby was resolute in his denials. He was quite a practiced liar. He had a very clear story that he stuck to throughout his evidence. But we were able to expose his underlying character through careful questioning and reveal him to be a dishonest person who told lies throughout his life to suit his own purposes.
After 5 days of the trial, it was time for the jury to return their verdict.
And then all of a sudden, just out of the blue, wasn't expecting it, they said, have you reached a verdict to which you all agreed? And the foreman said yes. And then they said guilty, and that's the point where I started to grieve again.
The jury unanimously convicted David Roustaby of the murder of David Clarke.
And it was just grief and joy and incredulation, if there is such a word. It was just everything, all sort of like everything that we'd been through over the past 6-7 months just suddenly all merged into that one word. The re-grieving process, believe it or not, started the minute I heard the word guilty. That's when it started again. Sorry. And there were tears. I was crying, sister was crying, and because we just weren't expecting it.
Roustaby was sentenced to life with a minimum of 19 years. His partner was also sent to prison.
She was found guilty of assisting an offender and was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison.
She suggested through her QC when she came to be sentenced that effectively she was forced into doing things by David Roustaby and that he effectively controlled what she did and she was scared of him.
I can almost forgive her for what she did, not for keeping the secret for 13 years, because I think she was literally put in a situation by a controlling man.
For Angela and David Clarke's family, justice felt bittersweet.
We felt heard. We finally felt heard. Because you can't change what's happened. You can't change what's happened to David. You can't change how the police dealt with it in 2007. There is nothing that can change any of that.
Angela has nothing but praise for the 2020 investigation team led by DCI Nicola Holden.
And they're still available to me if I want to talk to them, if I want to ring them up, ask them questions. They've even tried to support me through this process of being interviewed for this programme. They said that they want to see this whole process through, right the way through to the reissue of his death certificate. They have definitely not said, job done, move on. They're just, I can't praise them enough. I just can't.
You know, knowing that David was murdered and then almost, I can't speak for them, but certainly are they going back through his death again and actually having to sit through a trial. It's a huge thing to hear all these things. but ultimately they got David's story told in court, really. So I think the impact on the family probably was quite huge, monumental. From a policing perspective and from ourselves, it was a very interesting investigation, going over cold cases and historical investigations. One that was not deemed as suspicious is always very interesting, because you're challenging yourself almost. I mean, certainly there was days I was challenging myself as to saying, well, actually, is this correct? Is it true? Because actually you're having to test yourself probably twice, because it's already been deemed as not suspicious for one time. So now you're saying, well, actually that's incorrect, but it's incorrect because of pockets of evidence that you have to then show, perhaps in a more amplified way.
David Roustaby took the life of a man who had fallen on dark and hard times and was vulnerable because of his alcohol addiction, which had ruined his life. David Clarke's family were ready to help him if only he could quit the booze, and they knew he wanted to.
I didn't have a lot to do with him. It was mainly telephone or text messages. He just wanted to get back with me. He just wanted to get back together, but I stuck to my guns about the alcohol. Because there's no way I could carry on living like the way we were towards the end of our relationship. He might have done something different, he might have moved away, he might have got out of that circumstances that he was living in. But all of that was taken from him. That choice was taken from him.
David Roustaby will be eligible for parole in 2039. For analyst Donna Youngs, David Clarke stood little chance against a man almost groomed to be a killer.
This gnawing, persistent, low-level, bubbling hatred of everything and everyone, combined with this absolute recklessness, this nihilistic sense of self-destruction, of not caring. You put those two things together and we were always going to see something tragic happen to somebody who came into his path.
Ironically, Roustaby had stayed with a partner for a relatively long period. He lived, apparently normally, amongst the York community. But he was a killer in their midst, a fact which made him more dangerous.
This vicious circle just developed over time and led to him becoming a murderer, which is more frightening than somebody who's born unable to see clearly, unable to think clearly, or who suffers horrific abuse. That, in a sense, the fact that he's so normal and yet can become a murderer is more frightening.
Now here we go. going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Pray for you back there again. Pray for me to back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. If I could remind of your baby you made.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a talk.